people, I guess I would say, people who worked high up in institutions in London and New York, who were interested in this theme, the unknown political prisoner, being their monument that they could erect maybe in London, maybe in West Berlin, that could rival these sort of monuments that the Soviets had erected all over Eastern Europe. And so actually, the chairman of the entire committee visited Treptower Park. In this park, he came up with this idea that he's like, we need this as a sort of propaganda tool. Because art at this time was seen as being deep within the Cold War realm, not only because of the public monuments, but also because of sort of the landscape of French communism changing the avant-garde art world, and also in general, sort of this desire to find a way to kind of memorialize this unimaginable suffering that had just taken place. But it was definitely very politically motivated and politically loaded. And so this group, led by a man named Anthony Cloman, sort of decided, we will create this competition. We will use our ties to American industry, to American kind of art intelligentsia, to state officials, and we will gather this funding, which was about $150,000 in 1951, just to fund sending out all the pamphlets and to receive all of these sculptures shipped from 57 countries all around the world. And so they devised this competition with also massive prizes at the time. You know, for them, this is huge, which is that essentially the winner, aside from having his, sculpture be built at a huge scale, would also be receiving, 4,500 pounds. 10 runners-up would all get 750 pounds. And all of these would be shown at the Tate Modern in London. And so this was kind of a huge deal. And they hoped that they would actually get the Russians to participate. But the whole communist bloc read this theme for what it was, which was that unknown political prisoner was coded language for the only political prisoners that existed in, let's say, Western media in the 1950s were either those who suffered in Hitler's camps or those who were in Stalin's gulags. Anyone else anywhere in the world was not really being considered a political prisoner. And so because of this obvious connotation, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, the whole communist bloc all boycotted the competition. But other than that, you did get huge amounts of submissions from, huge amount from America, huge amount from Europe, especially Western Europe. But then you also had this huge amount that came in from India, from Korea, from Japan, from all of these different also colonies throughout Africa, where just somehow someone had heard of the competition. It was massively advertised. And so everything went out, invitations, coordination. In 1951, 1952, you saw all of these. And then finally, maquettes began to be sent in. The little statuettes began to be observed and evaluated by all of the juries and the judges to decide. In the end, they received over 3,500 entries from around the world. And so with that, they had a lot of work to do, all of these judges. And there was some unhappiness among the judges because they still had not decided where the big monument would be built. And because of that, the judges felt, how can we actually evaluate the success of any of these maquettes if we cannot imagine what place they would be installed? We don't know the city, we don't know the landscape. And to them, they thought one of the most essential parts of a monument, a public monument, is how does it interact with the world around the monument, the people around it, the city around it, the natural environment. And so as these rolled in, they began deciding, and the first signs of trouble really for this whole competition, that it might erupt in a bit of a scandal, let's say, the failure that John Berger calls it, is that when the finalists, the American finalists are named, there are 12 that are going to be shown at MoMA and then sent on to London to be considered for the winner. And when those are shown in MoMA, the New York Sculptural Society essentially rejects it. These are the winning American models. As you can see from them, which might be the first thing that appears kind of, is that maybe only one of them involves the figure of a human, right? There's one in the top row, and the rest of them are incredibly avant-garde, abstract, expressionist sculptures, constructivist sculptures. And this was a big source of actually outrage in the artistic community in New York. Specifically, city artists angered by sculpture prizes, new sculpture protests, head of society here assails it. The head of the National Sculpture Society in the US said a grave injustice has been done to the cause of sculpture by selecting these winners. And on top of that, the Modern Art Museum had been so assailed by the public that they actually had to answer this criticism in the press and defend their decision, saying these are the winners, we chose them. And a lot of the reason that this was rejected by the Sculptural Society was they felt this is not reflective of American sculpture. They said these abstract configurations are not actually what most American sculptors are doing right now. MoMA might care more about what Europeans are doing than what Americans are doing. And the Sculpture Society sort of said, we like naturalistic sculpture. If you had actually selected many of the hundreds, thousands, like I think there were hundreds of rejected American entries that showed a figure of a prisoner, I think all of these groups would have been much happier. But they hated the idea that MoMA was forcing this sort of abstract agenda onto now what would be the American entries into the international competition. And so all the same, this little bit of scandal erupted, and then still these were the ones sent on to Europe, and they all went to Britain along with all of the other international entries to be considered for the winner. The other thing that some of them disliked was that some of these winners, such as Noam Gabo, also Gabriel Kahn, Wharton Esherick, Alexander Calder. These names might not be so familiar now, but in the 1950s, these were considered the darlings of the art scene. So it also seemed to the public that the judges had completely chosen the most established sculpturists that had entered. You know, they had taken no risks, and that all of these sculpturists had also perhaps not really responded to the theme, but just submitted work that they felt could be accepted, perhaps. You know, it was very much in their existing oeuvre, and that was not really something that the American public wanted. And as these all went to the UK, actually this would be kind of a warning of things to come. Because as they went to the UK, you would continue to have major prizes awarded to a lot of very abstract and constructivists. And I don't have a problem with the constructivists personally. I just find all of this sort of scandal that erupts, the amount that people cared about these forms, that they could be in some way insulted that these are the unknown political prisoner statues sent from America. I think it's really interesting to be in such an active artistic community. And I do think it also shows that there is this divide, right? So some of even the American winners, such as Noam Gabo, is actually a Russian artist who had emigrated to the United States in the 1930s. And he essentially was someone who him and his brother, who actually entered from France as well, Antoine Pevsner, both were huge advocates of the constructivist sculptural model at the time, which were these highly engineered mathematical sculptures. And they were all meant to be public monuments. They were really interested in changing the face of public monuments. And they thought that, you know, they trusted a few of the people who were on the juries and that this would be a good competition for them. But with that said, you know, there was also this desire among some of these artists who came from Europe to not do something figural, because they did associate, such as I said kind of at the beginning, there were these artists who really associated monuments of men standing with all of the monuments that went up as Europe went to war during World War II. And so as this goes on, we come to London, and this is actually the prize-winning monument. This is what is awarded out of 100 different finalists from all over the world put on display in London. This is our prize winner by Reg Butler, a British artist. And if you can imagine, the public in Britain was even more unhappy with this winner than the American public was with all of the New York. The British public was no different than the American public. Their first thought was, why is the winner of the unknown political prisoner a tangled mass of wires, is a quote, a telephone wire that has broken. These are, I mean, the British tabloids had a field day. Bless you, no lady, that's part of the water system. Like, this is part of the reportage on the unknown political prisoner. You can see that they literally lampooned it. There were covers of magazines that had the artist with his little maquette, and it said, a man won 4,500 pounds for this. And essentially, there was the same kind of outrage that there was in America, that, you know, people wanted a real public monument with a figure, with a person, with a prisoner, with something that felt like it really engaged the theme. And they did not feel that this was representative of them. They felt this, again, was sort of avant-garde interests being pushed on the public. And so this had been open for days. And now the real thing that came down on it was finally when several days into it, and this is around the time that John Berger writes his scathing review, in which he says that this was a complete and total failure, that this entire competition failed to produce any major significant new artwork, it failed to engage the public, and in his opinion, it failed to meaningfully engage with the issues of their time. To him, what he felt was that a lot of these were actually just playing it safe and afraid to deal with the problems. But the real issue came when finally, on the third day of it being open, a museum-goer came and, so upset at the prize winner, destroyed it with his bare hands, grabbed the little maquette and twisted and bent it and stomped on it until he was then arrested on the spot and thrown in jail for having done so. So the things I like about this are really that, one, that the fact that the unknown political prisoner competition produces a known political prisoner, that this man is actually in prison for 2 weeks, and what is revealed about him is that actually this man's name, Laszlo Silvasi, is a survivor of Hitler's camps in Hungary. He is actually in Britain, stateless, and arrested, and in this incident, it is revealed that he is here illegally, and so he has to answer for the damage to the prize, and he has to answer for his refugee status in the UK. And his answer, what's presented in the press, is that he has a little manifesto that says this artwork is futile to concentration camp sufferers, that this avant-garde work could never represent the horrific suffering that he experienced in the camps. And again, this is a popular idea at the time, and this is something that, again, I don't necessarily agree with, but I think this is what people were reacting to in the public, which is that how can this wire sculpture somehow stand in for the horrors that people such as Laszlo Silvasi, who's also a painter himself, though never became very famous, how can this artistic form represent those horrors? And essentially, I think this is the debate of the competition. And what John Berger is also trying to get at when he's saying that all of these entries were playing it safe by being abstract, that there is a real interest in the 1950s to not respond to the urgent political matters of the time, and that he sees that particularly reflected in the Western art world, that in the Western Europe and American art world, they're rejecting the socialist realism of the Soviet Union, which wants to show workers, the struggle of the working class, the struggle of poverty. And they're saying that, he's like, they're dealing with real issues in the Soviet Union through their art, whereas we are dealing with sort of generalized, constructions that are meant to in some way create the spirit of the issue. And, John Berger sort of rejects this as a type of cowardice. But his essay is not the only one. This spawns massive debate where people on all sides pretty much of the failure of this competition, because once the prize-winning monument is destroyed and the press is making fun of it, it is a scandal. Everyone begins to see that this is a failure. No one reviews this exhibition well. And there's huge debates in the press. This is a great one I love because two people are both arguing about the status of abstract contemporary modern art. And both, one is meant to defend, let's say, abstract art, and the new abstract avant-garde. And the other is sort of a naturalist. On the left here, we have Wheeler Williams, who is the one who said after the New York MoMA opened that this was a disgrace to sculpture. And then on the right side, you have Felix Frankfurter, who is a major art critic at the time, who says that actually, sort of avant-garde art is good, but both of them accuse each other of being a communist. Literally, no. So Wheeler Williams says, wow, Felix Frankfurter, if you like abstract art so much, you must be a communist. All the abstract artists in France and all of these, Picassos and whatnot, they're all communists, And then on the other side, Felix Frankfurter says, well, you love naturalism so much. You love reality. You know who loves reality? The Soviets. They love socialist realism. You must be a socialist realist. And so everyone on all sides sort of gets very defensive and accuses the other side of being truly a communist for whatever side of style they like in sculpture. And it does just kind of continue to erupt. And in the midst of this scandal surrounding the prize winner, let's put it this way, the backers, the anonymous backers who funded the whole competition, who funded it through MoMA and through the Tate Modern, who had been in back alley channels talking about it, they started to get cold feet. on putting up another $150,000 to erect this wire sculpture in essentially West Berlin. They had entered into negotiations, and through the help of the US State Department, which who had essentially been, all of this was essentially that the director of MoMA, the director of the Tate Modern, and the director of the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London were all communicating with the US State Department. The US State Department was acting as an intermediary for the CIA, who actually put up all of the money of the competition. The entire competition, unbeknownst to almost anyone except for the highest levels of the competition, had been funded by the CIA to create a kind of freedom monument, anti-communist monument over the Berlin Wall. And this was unknown to the winner. This was unknown to all of the judges who participated. It was known only to Albert Barr, the founder of MoMA, the head of the Tate Modern, and Anthony Cloman, who was essentially sort of a shadowy figure who used to be in the CIA, who had art world connections. And that's why he was chosen to sort of be the go-between. And after this all became such a scandal and people were rejecting the winner, they decided, the CIA is like, well, you know, we actually don't feel we're obligated to pay another $100,000 to erect this. We'll give you a little money maybe. We'll give you maybe $5,000. And if you can raise the other $145,000, then you can build it, you know? And they went, and again, all of these directors who are on the line here, who've put out their name and reputation saying that actually we're gonna build this monument, these people are suddenly like, oh my God, we need to find money from somewhere because the CIA is screwing us over. They're pulling the funding because they don't like how abstract the monument is and that people hated it. And so they scramble for a decade. They get the West German parliament to give them 10 grand. They get a wealthy benefactor to give them another 10 grand. They almost get 50 grand together. And then pretty much by like the late 50s, it all falls through. There's one final push and it all collapses. And you can read all of this in the MoMA archives, because you can see the head of MoMA, Albert Barr, trying to get the CIA to pay him by sending letter after letter and getting letter after letter back that's sort of like, we don't feel we quite had to confirm that we would pay, and we don't feel any further obligation, and we appreciate that you reached out. Like very polite letters where the CIA is pretty much just like, there's no way in hell we're giving you another dime for your competition. And so this is sort of why a lot of this is seen as a failure. But I do think that the competition is not a failure. It is not a failure, but it's not because of who won, and it's not because of the desire to have this monument built. It is because of the dozens of entries from Africa and Asia, and their contribution actually cements this moment where we get to see all of these entries from an emerging anti-colonial consciousness, where actually none of them won. None of them even placed. Any of the ones from Iraq, Palestine, Korea, Japan, anywhere from any of the colonies, people committed from colonies in Africa, you know, on the verge of independence in some cases. None of these won anything, but they have been preserved partially because of the archives that came out of this competition and partially because they were able to use their success in this competition to kind of up their reputation back home in their nations that then became newly independent and where they began to actually build some of these monuments and build off of the work that they submitted to the unknown political prisoner competition. So I actually love the John Berger essay because he actually hones in on one of them. His only compliment in the entire essay to any piece is, one brave if unresolved exception was an entry from Indonesia by Eddie Sunarso. Now, Eddie Sunarso submitted this piece, Tapal Tak Dikenal, which is essentially unknown political prisoner in Indonesia. Now, I like to focus on Eddie Sunarso because Berger didn't know this about him. He didn't know almost anything about Eddie Sunarso. But because Eddie Sunarso went on to be a major Indonesian sculptor, there's a lot of history about him, which is that actually Eddie Sunarso was a political prisoner. And for him, this whole competition was not about communist and anti-communist. This competition was about colonialism. He had just come out of 7 years in Dutch prison camps for having been a freedom fighter in Indonesia. And after being released from a Dutch prison camp after 7 years, Indonesia was independent and he became an artist. He went in at, I think, like 16 years old, came out at 23, and became one of Indonesia's first avant-garde sculptors. he submits to this competition at the invitation of a prominent former revolutionary friend who's now a member of the government and somehow heard there was this international competition. And again, this work, you can see why Berger maybe would have liked this in comparison to these incredibly abstract works. He felt this was someone who actually wants to deal with the reality of imprisonment, the emaciation, the shackle, but also who doesn't give in to sort of pessimism, which I think was also a criticism many had, that the winners that even did, were sometimes just people in cages, were other entries that they saw, and they thought there's no dignity to this, and that there was real dignity to Eddie Sonarso's piece of the revolutionary fighter who is emaciated and shackled but will not give up the gun. And again, this kind of actually led him into having something that he'd done which allowed President Sukarno to trust him with major monuments in Indonesia. So his next monument, which is erected at massive scale, is the Liberation Monument, the West Irian Liberation Monument, which essentially is sort of, I would say, Indonesia's independence monument, which is when the Dutch granted independence, they did not grant it to one region of Indonesia. They said, this is actually still Dutch. West Iria is still Dutch. And so they had to launch a second war to liberate West Iria from the Dutch colonialists. And so he was able to build this monument, which was for the West Irian liberation. And it became this massive monument of the non-aligned movement, this massive monument of the end of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia. And so this is why I kind of think that when you look at these other entries, this competition is not a failure. You really see actually that the people who were not placing, the people who were not significant to the press, other than John Berger in the UK, these people coming from this emerging colonial landscape were actually going to build off of this and change the cityscapes of Indonesia, of Japan, of Korea. So that's a great piece, and another one that actually is my entry point into this. The first piece I ever saw from this competition, which was housed by the Palestine Digital Archive, housed by the Birzeit University in Ramallah, was a piece by Fatima Al-Maheb. Fatima Al-Maheb was a 28-year-old Palestinian woman who had just survived the Nakba 4 years earlier. Her family had fled attacks by the Israeli Zionists, and she had gone to Jordan. Her unknown political prisoner was submitted. It was the lone entry from Palestine. It was one of only 3 Arab entries from the Arab world, and it's incredibly different than the other monuments. It's also, I think, of all of the monuments I've looked at, one of the only ones who chose to represent the unknown political prisoner as a woman. And her piece, actually did allow her to get some notoriety as a young woman who is an artist in Palestine at a time where there were very few women. There were very few modern artists, period, in Palestine, because a lot actually who were the earliest wave of modern artists, many died during the Nakba. And there was only a few handfuls who were kind of from that first wave who survived, and Fatima Al-Maheb was one of them. She was someone who had gone to a painting school in Jerusalem prior to the Nakba. She had begun a kind of contemporary arts education, fled the Nakba, and then in 1951 submitted her unknown political prisoner entry to the UK. It was accepted, and she actually went to the UK with 2 family members and was there for the finalist exhibition. And hers was not remarked upon at all by the British, American, European press. It was not something that received any awards other than it being one of the 100 international finalists, but it was incredibly well received in the Arab world. And it actually did go on display. It graced the covers of magazines. It went on display. The maquette, when it returned to Palestine, was on display in Jordan. And it actually then did kind of give her this footing to become a major Palestinian artist in Jordan, and then later the return to the West Bank. And you see that actually her work, she then became someone who illustrated children's literature. She did postcards for Jordan and Palestine. She worked for the Jordanian tourism industry. She made textbooks. She was a painter in her own right. She continued to write poetry. And a lot of this, it's funny to say, did come off of the Arab world recognizing the sort of international success of her monument, the unknown political prisoner, which I'll go back to it for a moment just to pause on it. It is, a woman bound round the torso with barbed wire, blindfolded, with 2 other women and a child at her side, standing atop the globe with her feet where Palestine are. And I think this is, again, to remember that the organizers imagined that the winner of this competition would have essentially made a monument to the horrors of communism. But what happens when you look at the Indonesian entry and now Fatima Al-Maheb's entry in Palestine is it is a monument to the horrors of colonialism. That most of their entries, actually, what we have here is a monument to the Nakba, What we have with Eddie Sonarso is a monument to the horrors of Dutch colonialism. And as you keep going, all of this has led me, most of this you can't find none of this is really in the MoMA archives, but if you follow up each of the entries through their home countries, if their artists became prominent enough, you can find out more about their histories and their work. And that's sort of how I've been able to find this. Again, this was all hosted, all of the visual material here, by the Birzeit University in Ramallah. And it's free to research online. And so as you continue to see it develop, I'm gonna focus on a few more. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. I should check that, actually. Oh no, we're doing okay. And so this is another one that I think, again, continues to show that actually this competition was pivotal in this emerging anti-colonial avant-garde sculpture, so this is Jawad Salim. Jawad Salim is a major Iraqi artist who is actually the founder of the Baghdad Modern Arts Group in 1958. And he had been working, he's someone who left Iraq in his 20s, was able to actually become educated in painting and sculpture in Italy, and then he returned to Iraq right before they overthrew their British-backed monarch. And after overthrowing the British-backed king, he became this major influential artistic figure. But prior to that happening, in 1952, 5 years before the British-backed monarch was overthrown, he submitted his Unknown Political Prisoner. And again, he is one of the major Arab artists who was shown in London. It gave him a little bit of background to show that he had shown international sculpture. And then when they overthrew the British-backed king, and it was a bloody revolution in which the British-backed king was killed in the palace, and the prime minister was actually found in the streets of Baghdad and killed by a crowd of people trying to escape Baghdad. And after this took place, and Iraq was independent and began building what Iraq would be in the post-colonial era, Jawad Salim was selected on the merits of his work to create the Freedom Monument, which still stands in Baghdad today. Kind of a triumph of this early era before Saddam, before years and years of American interference and bombing campaigns, this avant-garde art scene that erupted in 1958, led partially by Jawad Salim and also many others, this monument still stands today as a testament to that. And there's also a lot of Arab art historians who like to look at sort of the shapes that the Unknown Political Prisoner kind of makes, and they see them in sort of some of the shapes that you see where the hand is punching through the fencing, and the hand where there's also another torch up there in the center, and to show that actually this was a crucial part of the evolution of his work. And if we go on, another piece that I think really gets at how other people took this competition in a direction that the Cold War kind of propagandist organizers did not anticipate was Ramkin Karbej. Ramkin Karbej was an Indian sculptor who essentially made his piece, which is called Harvester Thresher, and actually was installed, it's about 10 feet high, I forget where, but in a sort of site that's somewhere in rural India that I do know has like 5 of his sculptures in a sculpture garden. But Harvester Thresher, he entered into Monument for the Unknown Political Prisoner, and to him, he chose the harvester of wheat to be the symbol of the unknown political prisoner because of the famine that had just been engineered by the British during World War II. The British had purposefully starved Bengal, the region that Ramkin Karbaj was from, and over, I think, 2 million people had been tactically starved by the British during World War II to export wheat to feed the soldiers in Europe. And so Ramkin Karbaj made this statue, and he was someone who, his work, he was not someone who came from high caste, he was a very low caste person who believed that art should actually show the dignity of people who are low caste in India, which is why he chose workers, harvesters, people who worked the land, and he liked to use materials that he thought could actually reflect that sort of textural relationship to the land. So he would make iron sculptures, kind of like wrought iron, into the shape he would want, and then the way he would actually sculpt was he would flick concrete on the iron sculpture until it made these surfaces. So this is literally just, days and days of flicking concrete to give it this texture until this shape comes to be. This was, again, written about nowhere in the Western press, was not significant to the competition, but it shows this, what the archives of this competition reveal is this incredible emerging anti-colonial sculptural form that's so different from place to place. And similarly, one I really like is one of the few ones that we see from a lot of the colonies in Africa is Osai Bonsu, who is in Ghana under British control at the time, literally right before Ghana will become the first African nation to overthrow its colonizer and become independent. He submits his work, which is he had had a few major artists collectors from Britain sort of be the ones to introduce him to the competition. He was an Ashanti woodcarver who actually was the court woodcarver for the Ashanti elite. And this is a picture of his wood carvings among some of the Ashanti elite with him seated beside them. And his entry, which I think is incredible, this is his political prisoner. And so if you see on the right the two people in gold, he would paint in gold the elite of the Ashanti tribe. And then in the yellow and the black are colonial policemen. And in the center, handcuffed, is the prisoner. And so this was his entry to the political prisoner competition. And it is, you could not have it clearer, a breakdown of society in which he lives and the role of the colonial police. And the role of a person who, again, you don't know why they're handcuffed. All you know is that he would titled his the political prisoner. And so he's immediately drawing this line that actually, if I'm to show our society, which is what he tried to do through his wood carvings, this is our society. You have the Ashanti elite, you have the colonial police officers, and you have us, shackled as political prisoners. Ghana would be free within about a year. And I could keep going about more. This is a Turkish entry. This is Kim Chong-young, one of the people who submitted from Korea. And I could tell you about the Egyptian entry. But I think, you're starting to get the picture. And as we kind of get closer to the end, I'd love to leave a little time for questions if anyone has them, or if anyone has any comments or thoughts on the topic. But yeah, it kind of goes deeper and deeper. And it's been a big project of digging into these archives in multiple languages. In some cases, having other people who have language help that I don't have, such as I had someone help me to research the Korean, because that is not one I can do. But yeah, and I'm still trying to track down Japanese entries. I have a list of names, but I have not been able to find any that have survived in the archives yet, but I think this is also part of a linguistic barrier that I have. But yeah, thank you. That's sort of the monument to the unknown political prisoner. Publication forthcoming. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, or comments?
If you want, I can talk more. Or you can take this as the opportunity to go, because I know we have more people coming in. Or how much time we have? Oh, we still have a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, in that case, you know what? If anyone has a question, raise your hand at any time, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of these. So, Zutu Muradoglu, on the far left here, you kind of have this Turkish entry, which he is someone who, again, he's one of 3 artists who are kind of this very new, rough form that is sort of this avant-garde form in Turkey at the time, which is not constructivist. It is still sort of abstract and expressionist, but they're really into raw materials, wood, bent metal. They want it to seem almost like visceral to touch. And this is their unknown political prisoner, which, to be perfectly honest, I think has, while it's, again, one of the abstract ones, I think this is one of the abstract ones I like. I think there is something, after looking at all of these, that I see to the merit of the sort of unknown political prisoner here. There's something that binds, there's something that constricts, and yet also the wood, if I'm imagining that as sort of like what is being constricted, rises above, rises slightly out of it. Perhaps it's a little too pessimistic for my taste, in the sense that it does seem dark. I don't think there's enough of the heroism, perhaps the dignity of the prisoner that could come across. I think that's something that could be better. Kim Chong-young, this is not him pictured with his entry. His entry actually is a shape that, I said Fatima al-Mahebs is the only one that chose a woman as its figure. Kim Chong-young, in a way, chooses a woman. I don't have his photo in here, though I should have. But it's essentially a very abstract woman. It still is like kind of the curves and shapes of a body. And I don't know if, for my taste, he plays with the idea of the political prisoner enough. Yes, please, question in the back.
I have a question about the contemporary state of this topic. Do you know any contemporary artists who are doing monuments on this topic now?
That's a great question. Of the unknown political prisoner?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I do know anyone who is doing it, but are you familiar with things?
I am not familiar with the names, but I would say if you search for Ukraine.
Ukraine, okay, that's great to look into.
That would be.
I have looked at some, they don't call themselves, again, the name, the unknown political prisoner, but if there's anything that I have been keeping my eye on, there have been a bunch of monuments going up in Syria since the prisons have been liberated, since the fall of Assad. And there have been both murals and monuments, and there is not enough documentation coming out, and I know that they're still in the midst of commissioning some of these places, like in the most horrific prison, Sednaya. I know they're actually in the process of commissioning a public monument now. But that is a place where I have also been looking, and I'll definitely be looking into Ukraine as well, because I do think these are interesting things to be like, where does this sit today? And I think the questions that this competition is asking, that essentially is the center of this debate, right? Which is, does modern art play it safe? Or can it respond really to the horrific things that are happening today in a prescient way? Is the question of us also responding to Gaza right now. You know, I think of this obviously when I look at Fatima al-Maheb. I think of this obviously there's more than just Gaza going on. You know, there is Ukraine, there are many horrific things, but I do think we live in an era where the resurgence of genocide, of horrific forces, of mass imprisonment are so evident to us. And I do think the art world, since the genocide in Gaza began, has been trying to reckon with what is our place in this landscape, because it has completely shifted the art world. And it has revealed that a lot of artists cannot engage meaningfully with the problems of society. But I think there are others who are actually trying to do that. Like, I do think this is shifting constantly.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go back. One other thing I like to talk about, which is, okay, he gets a lot of hate. He gets a lot of hate, our prize winner, Reg Butler. You know, but I actually think there's some merit to Reg Butler's piece. I think that I would not have chosen it as my winner. But to be so reviled in the press, I actually think there are things that are compelling about this. So he imagined it actually not where the organizers wanted to put it, which was, you know, on a hill in West Berlin overlooking the Berlin Wall. He imagined it on the white cliffs of Dover in England, you know, overlooking the sea. And so that's kind of why he like put his maquette into this like white block. And I actually think, okay, Britain is such a hyper-surveillance society. You know, Britain is the country in the world, or actually London is the city in the world where you are videotaped the most of your day anywhere in the world. And Britain is the country that really engineered a lot of mass surveillance before it was exported to the rest of the world. And I think his massive tangled wires, okay, I think that it gives something about surveillance and imprisonment. I think that the fact that this would rise on the coast of England signals to me, yes, some of the surveillance apparatus of the state, and that is hand in hand with imprisonment is compelling to me. And I think that comes across to my eye and actually is kind of ahead of its time for 51, 52, 53. And then second, I do think there is a cage-like structure to it. And then he put these little figures to show these little figures would be statues that would be at the foot. And there is something that I think he was trying to do is that, you know, the ladder does not necessarily lead up or down. You don't know what's going on here, but there is, I think, meant to be the suggestion that could be a ladder, that these people may have been kept up there and have escaped, that there is a suggestion of freedom, of mobility, of openings, not just closings. I think there is a dignity to that. And I do think the question of dignity was something utterly lacking with some of these, such as, okay, the top to the right, this tangled, the body almost in barbed wire is how I think of it. This body pierced through 100 times. This one placed and got like a $750 runner-up. This is an Italian entry, Mario Basaldella. And to me, I see nothing good here. To me, I see imprisonment, I see torture, I see no dignity. I see pain, I see suffering, and to me, that is a failing of it. Perhaps it gets constriction across, but I think if you're to do something like the unknown political prisoner, it cannot just be all pain and suffering, a body pierced through 100 times. There must be something of the dignity. There must be something of the heroism. There must be something of the suggestion of the end of the imprisonment, not just the eternity of it. I kind of have a soft spot for this one, Ted Roszak. He does sort of like almost like mutant naturalism, which I think was like so different from the rest of the entries that I give it some credit, though again, I would not have awarded this one either. Anyway, these are a lot of my thoughts. I like the one on the bottom right. I literally don't even know who did it. It showed up in one article of Time. It's a maquette that like the label didn't quite come out in the article in Time. They didn't give it a caption. It's incredibly literalistic, which is I think what I like about it. And fun, all these avant-garde ones having like a naked woman rising out of the rubble that says prejudice, ignorance, and then she's holding fight for freedom at the top. I don't know. All these like really toned down ones that kind of refuse to communicate their message. I do like that there's one that's like so in your face with it. There's also some great ones that aren't in here that like did not really place but are held in archives in America. Like there's an Iowa preacher who submitted one, and it is of for lack of a better way of saying it, if you like nailed Jesus to a cross backwards, so it's like he was ass out. It's kind of funny, I would say, but I like it for that reason too. And that's actually preserved in an archive. Yeah.
What's the deal with the bottom left one?
Like this one right here.
Yeah.
So this is Esherick Wharton's The Pear. And so Esherick Wharton, I would say, is someone who essentially a lot of their work looks kind of like this. So I think it's compelling, and actually there is a work sort of, if you imagine instead of having these two like kind of like straight and rising together, but instead they twisted together, there is a monument Esherick Wharton did that I think is somewhere in the countryside of the UK that built off of this, and it's called Aspiring Pear. And it's almost exactly this, it's just that they twist together and rise into the sky. I don't think it really responds to the theme, but this is again one of the criticisms that people had in the public was that this was awarded, one of the finalists, and it was one of these ones where people were like, this didn't really respond to the theme. It's just that Wharton Esherick is an incredibly prominent sculptor at the time, and I think the judges and the organizers thought that if they award major artists the prizes, then the whole international art world will respect them. And instead, the press kind of saw through that. They sort of were like, okay, you awarded all the darlings the awards, so you thought that it would seem like a major competition, but actually none of theirs were very good, and they don't respond to the theme. And actually, if you'd gone with some of the ones that were maybe not big names, but really tried to respond to the theme, this whole competition would have been better. But again, in the judges' defense, they had no idea where this would go. And they really, I think, chose sometimes more abstract ones, not because they were so tone deaf to society, but because without the context of where the monument would go, I think it felt easier for them to choose something that felt like it could be plopped anywhere. Anyway, with that, thank you so much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you for being here.